One of the worst things a critic can say about a game is that they have nothing to say. And that about sums up my feelings towards Cloudpunk. I struggle to form the words for this one. It's not necessarily that I literally have nothing to say, it's just that this one was the epitome of boredom for me. I simply don't want to do this review, as thinking back on this game practically puts me to sleep. I mean, sure, there's some hyperbole there, but I truly do care so little about this title that wasting time scripting and editing this one together kinda makes me annoyed. It's a level of annoyance that permeated the entire experience, as I don't think it did anything for me but waste my time. It may not be the most incompetent or outright broken game I've played this year. That award still goes to Fast and the Furious Crossroads, but it doesn't speak highly when I'd still rather go back and play that than ever turn on Cloudpunk again. Being brutally honest, Crossroads at least had stuff to do. As I've been open about before, I have a soft spot for walking simulators and narrative-driven experiences, but if you call back to my review of The Suicide of Rachel Foster from a couple months ago, I stated that story-centric games still need an interactive hook. With Rachel Foster, I quite adored its hotel environment and the fiction it told, but it fell apart because of overly long sequences of dialogue that stripped interactivity away from the player and forced them to just stand in place and spin in circles as they waited for conversations to end. This isn't always a detriment, as many games can and do succeed with long cutscenes or text box conversations. For example, Metal Gear Solid is one of my favorite franchises, and that does both. But unlike MGS, which also has excellent gameplay, Rachel Foster further fell apart as there just wasn't enough to do in the world, so the core game outside of walking was still mostly just talking. It's what sets apart the great walking sims from the mediocre, just plain bad ones. The great ones often have a lot of in-world interactions. I go on this lengthy tangent because this is where Cloudpunk entirely collapses in on itself. Outside of walking or driving from point A to point B, there's almost nothing for the player to do, and with excruciatingly long and often unskippable segments of dialogue, the game often left me holding my dick and spinning in circles as I just waited for the next objective to finally pop up. I'm not even exaggerating. Here's how a majority of the missions play out. You'll be flying your car or walking within a small section of the city only to receive a call from an NPC. This can go on for minutes, and it's not until it wraps up that you're given a destination to go towards to pick up an item or person or something. So usually I'd just stop and literally spin in circles as I waited for the chatting to stop because I didn't want to accidentally drive too far from where it wanted me to go. Once I received a destination, I'd fly there. However, sometimes you can't just land, as conversations can spark up on the drive, and these last much longer than the drive itself, so I'd be stuck waiting for it to wrap up so I could land the car in the designated parking area, only to ever so slowly walk through the environment, often needing to wait for lengthy elevator rides to wrap up so I could get to the spot I needed to be. I'd then grab the package or whatever, return to my car, to then drive once again from point A to point B, repeating essentially the same process. This is the entirety of the fucking game. There are pretty much no fail states, nor is there any real gameplay. And as stated, this can work in some narrative-driven games, but here it simply doesn't. Making it all so much worse is that much of the voice acting is utterly atrocious. The lead is particularly bad. It is one of the most wooden and stilted deliveries I've heard in a game in ages. I don't mean to insult the voice actress, but she is not at all good. It's as if she's never before properly read a script. She's completely unnatural and not at all conversational. And in a game entirely built around conversations, it sticks out like a very sore thumb. I get this is a lower budget indie game, but I've met high schoolers in drama club who could do an infinitely better job. Maybe the devs should have just tossed a kid a 20 instead. Making some conversations infinitely worse are when you're stuck staring at the character models. They're unintentionally hilarious until the joke wears off and it's just sad. I get that there's limitations with the game's voxel art, and I won't play it off as if the entire game looks terrible. The cityscape while flying through it is actually well done, as is the car and some other environmental objects, but the characters are just bad. I mean, look at this. It's hard to take a 5-minute dramatic conversation serious when this is what's staring you in the face. Only ruined further by the lead's stilted voice delivery. Speaking of the player character, thankfully there's 3 optional camera perspectives, and I was able to block her character model from view. There's a fixed camera almost side-scroller mode, a traditional third-person setting, and a first-person one. I settled on the first-person perspective and never went back. The movement also felt much less wonky here. As for the game itself, it's classified as an adventure game, but with minimal puzzles to solve and little input from the player outside of moving from one location to another, and with only 4 total missions even implementing a time trial. I think the moniker of adventure game is far too lenient. It's more like a visual novel with extra directional input than is typical with them. Like, honestly, this is best defined as a narrative experience, but whether it succeeds as one is totally in the eye of the beholder. But from my perspective, it totally fails as even that. Although, before explaining why, let me give a largely spoiler-free description of what it is all about. You play as Rania, a recent implant to the city of Novalis. The city itself is practically its own character as the dark and depressing skyscape is managed by an AI run amok, but to say more than that would be to delve into later game plot points, so I'll leave it there. Back to Rania, the game occurs during her very first night as a delivery driver for an illegal company named Cloudpunk. Naturally, it's during this night that all sorts of things occur, and she gets tied into a conspiracy of sorts, and meets various city dwellers who make her question the morality of the role she's taken on and the dystopian truths of the city she inhabits. As you venture forth completing missions, you earn money, and this can be used to upgrade your apartment. You have almost zero reason to ever visit outside of a couple story beats, and you can buy food and clothes, though this is also largely pointless. The only other thing money serves to do is to pay for gas, car repairs, and car upgrades. Being a story-driven game, there is a ton of exposition and story dumps, and admittedly, not all of it is bad. There is some strong writing within, notably with the side content, but for every moment that was good, like for instance a scene describing future sex and kink, there is something that made me cringe, like some character stereotypes introduced fairly early on, or even mentions of cultural appropriation. Yes, really. Obviously, with something like this, the mileage will vary per person, but for me, it just didn't do a whole lot. The main plot especially being a letdown, partially because of a completely obnoxious android character introduced midway through. But even negating that, huge chunks of the plot just didn't keep me hooked, which is why the narrative aspect of the game completely collapsed for me. As previously mentioned, there are overly long moments of dialogue, ones in which you can't even begin heading towards a destination until it wraps up. And with the story I was mostly disinterested in, a game that already felt like a slog became even more of one. The whole thing maybe lasted 10 to 15 hours, and that included doing every side quest and picking up every collectible, but it felt like 100. I was so freaking bored. Even as a game played with a podcast on in the background, it just dragged. And that's all I keep returning to on this game. It's boring. It's not even so bad I can passionately hate it. It's just so dull I don't want to think about it in any capacity. I've actually been putting off this review for the past week because forcing myself to sit down and write about it just seemed like another waste of time for a game that I felt like only wasted my time, which sucks. And yeah, as a critic, there's other things I should say about it. Like, the music is surprisingly great, and the voice actor behind a character named Control was actually not bad, but the load times on PS4 are longer than they should be, and on the topic of technical issues, multiple quest markers broke, and even after completing the objective, they never went away, staying in the upper corner the entire game. There's probably other things I can or should mention as well, but honestly, this game has wasted more than enough of my time, and I'm tired of being bored. Cloudpunk gets a 4 out of 10, and now let me never think about it again.